Putin's nuclear threat, how serious is it?
Well, look, I would say that when you have a leader who's losing a war like this and who is preparing to annex substantial amounts of territory so that he can portray Ukrainian attacks on some of these areas that you've just highlighted as being attacks on Russian soil, it is a real risk that has to be taken quite seriously. But, and it's an important but, we have consistently throughout this conflict seen Ukrainian attacks by helicopter raids, missiles, rockets, loitering munitions, drones, other capabilities on Crimea, which of course was annexed illegally by Russia in 2014, and even on Russian soil proper in places like Belgorod over the border in Russia over the course of the last several months. And so it's not as if Ukrainian attacks on Russian soil or Russian claimed soil would be unprecedented. Those attacks have passed without dramatic escalation. And to me, while we may see desperate, reckless acts by President Putin if he feels that his war is at serious risk of being lost, it is also important to remember that he has to contend with the fact nuclear use would bring a substantial risk of the very thing he has sought to avoid consistently since day one, which is open, overt NATO intervention in this conflict. And of course, we would have to contend with the response among countries that have been more pragmatic and cautious in their relations with Russia, countries like India, of course, who would also be, I think, alarmed and concerned by any suggestion of nuclear use in Ukraine.
It's almost unbelievable to hear this sort of rhetoric in 2022. It is absolutely unbelievable. Second question, Shashank, conscription, part conscription, what does that mean? What are the implications?
Well, look, I've consistently said that manpower has been one of Russia's most significant structural problems in this conflict. They haven't had enough of it. That's why the Ukrainians were able to find a weak spot in the Russian lines and break through, the spot that you pointed out just now on your maps. So any attempt at accumulating new manpower is helpful for Russia. They need these people. They have lots of battalions, Vishnu, that are operating at about 30-40% of their authorized strength, which is incredibly combat ineffective. So this is very significant. However, and there's a big however here, it's important to understand that the Russians have been conducting what we would call a shadow mobilization, paying very high salaries to former servicemen to enlist. And they've run into the limits of that. So the people who are now being enlisted, who are those with prior military service, are those who least wanted to do so in the previous 7 months. And having 300,000 warm bodies isn't enough. You need to equip them, you need to arm them, and you need to have officers for those units, as well as having equipment such as armored vehicles. And Russia is desperately short of all of those things. So I would be very, very surprised if we saw 300,000 usable, effective military forces within the next 6 months. I think the full impact of this will only be felt well into 2023. And by that point, the Ukrainians may well have made further territorial advances on the ground.
Yeah, because with the snows coming in just a couple of months from now, for Russia to mount a serious offensive and regain the territory which they have would be much more difficult than it is in fighting season, which is now going to end in a matter of weeks.
It is. It's not just that the ground will become muddy and sodden and it will constrain maneuver. That, of course, will affect Ukrainian units as much as it will affect Russian ones, because they also will be confined to roads and therefore vulnerable to ambushes. That's a problem on both sides. It's also that many of these Russian forces are fighting thousands of kilometers from home. Look, the Russian Eastern Military District, which goes as far east as Vladivostok, is deployed to Ukraine. How are these people going to fare under cold, wet, miserable conditions through a winter season in which they are on the back foot? Their troops are running short of artillery ammunition because American-supplied HIMARS rockets has taken out ammunition depot after ammunition depot, and militia forces the lines are collapsing in Luhansk province, which was taken, as you pointed out, at enormous cost over the summer months. I think it'll be tremendously demoralizing for Russian troops caught in those weather conditions, knowing full well that Ukraine is receiving more Western arms and ammunition, and indeed that Ukrainians are being trained by countries including the UK and will have a manpower advantage by the spring.